Hey guys, and welcome back for another video. If you happen to catch my last video, I went through 5 or rather 6 things that I'd like to add to the game, and now just as we wrap up 2018, I'd like to cover 5 or rather 6 things that I'd like to change. Do keep in mind that these are intentionally nonsensical, much like the first video, so just because I've included them here today does not mean that I would take these changes over other changes that are probably more important. This is just a list of unlikely changes to come into Guild Wars 2 that I personally would like to see.
Number 1. Daily activities.
Guild Wars 2 at this point is pretty much chock full of daily activities, but as a whole I've never really felt like any of them were all that interesting, and if you look at the rewards, they're sort of all over the place. For instance, if you've ever paid for the game and you log in, you'll get your daily login reward, and while the vast majority of these just seem like convenience items for being a paid player, items like Mystic Coins and Laurels just feel like they're a little too valuable for putting almost no effort in. Laurels are by no means a mandatory currency in Guild Wars 2, but they can help you get crafting materials and ascended trinkets, as well as many other things, way easier or at a discounted price due to the Laurels. While Mystic Coins are primarily used for cosmetic and legendary crafting, I just don't see why you would get these from logging in, especially when you consider that these are used to create legendary weapons. You think you would get them from completing legendary activities in the game. As a whole, I'd just like to see these 2 rewards move to other areas of the game that require you to actually complete some content. The regular daily, or the daily that requires you to actually play the game, is not all that interesting as a whole and doesn't reward nearly as well as the daily login reward does overall. Each day you complete this, you'll get 2 gold and 3 spirit shards, and I just feel like that's kind of a lame reward in comparison. At the very least, I'd like to see Laurels re-added to this daily, and at the same time I'd like to see the actual activities themselves become more unique. To do this, I think that the whole of the game should have a daily system reminiscent of the living world. In other words, every single map in the game has a hand-tailored list of dailies to complete. Maybe by completing multiple maps of these dailies builds into a better reward overall, and you could make a whole day out of your daily if you wanted to. For dailies, the last thing I'd like to change is Fractals of the Mist. Now, by no means am I saying take away the Fractal daily, but there are some issues with the way that it's designed. As it stands, every day there will be a series of fractals that are selected as the daily, and by completing them you'll get a bonus reward. But since fractals repeat themselves through all 4 tiers, the dailies also tend to repeat themselves, and if you should complete a tier 4 daily fractal, you'll get the reward and completion for all lower tier fractals that had that selected daily. As a result, players tend to just farm out all of the tier 4 daily fractals and then leave Fractals of the Mist to go play other content. Now this would be fine if the entire community was already at tier 4 fractals, but since we have players who are trying to raise their fractal level up and eventually get to that point, we need there to be a constant source of players willing to play those earlier fractals. To do this, I would split the fractal dailies up based on the tier and make each tier of dailies unique to each other so that you can't just play tier 4 and get all the rewards for tier 1, 2, and 3.
Number 2. Corteria Masteries.
At the release of Heart of Thorns, or just before it, we got an update to the game that added the Mastery system, or the horizontal progression system for Guild Wars 2 post level 80. As it applies to Heart of Thorns, the Mastery system allows you to unlock gliding, bouncing mushrooms, among many other things that change your gameplay as you play that expansion. Now that system definitely makes sense when you have new features to dispense to the players, but what happens when you don't really have new features to add? When the Mastery system was added to the game, they retroactively made up some masteries for Corteria. Now I do think things like legendary crafting as well as fractal attunement as far as the Corteria masteries are concerned are completely fine. I really only take issue with the Pack Commander mastery track, and I think more than anything it's because it feels really unnecessary. First, you'll be able to mentor heroes in Tyria, this allowing you to put an apple on your head that other players on your current map can see, and they could head over over to you the same way a lot of players do with a commander tag. Now, in order to unlock this mastery, all you have to do is get one level up and have one mastery point to unlock it, and it's basically a commander tag, which typically costs about 300 gold. Now, whether or not the commander tag should cost 300 gold is a topic for another video, but attaining 300 gold in-game, not using your credit card, but actually attaining 300 gold, takes a minute, and it's safe to say that if you get a commander tag, you probably have a decent idea of what's going on in the game. Or at the very least, you'll certainly have more to offer than a player who just hit 80 and spent one mastery point. Next, you'll unlock the ability to get 10% crafting experience. Yeah, I think this could have just been a consumable item instead of a mastery. After that, you'll gain access to a network of regional merchants across Tyria, and while these merchants certainly could have just been added to the core Tyria experience, I suppose this is a fine addition to a core Tyria mastery. Next up, you'll be able to revive people faster and with less penalties, but I just feel like this lacks a whole lot of flavor. And at the same time, shouldn't everybody have the same revive potential? And lastly, you'll get vacuum loot, automatic loot, whatever you want to call it, but this allows you to essentially loot without looting. For instance, if you're playing a fractal or a dungeon and there's a chest at the end, you don't actually have to walk up to the chest and loot it, rather everything will just pour into your inventory. Now obviously I'm fine with vacuum loot. I think that's a perfect addition to Guild Wars 2. I'm not so sure that it needed to be a mastery, but if that's what they wanted to do, I think that's fine. It's really just the reviving allies faster, gaining 10% bonus experience, and giving relatively unexperienced players the ability to have a commander tag whenever they want. These three in particular just feel sort of tacked on, and while I don't have incredible suggestions for what these could be changed out for, what if instead one of these would lower the cost of all waypoints in the game, or allow you to regularly teleport to Lion's Arch for free? And instead of faster revive times or bonus crafting experience, what if playing with a lower level player got you and that player increased experience? Rather than a commander tag, you can actually mentor that person and help them level up a little bit faster.
Number 3, competitive balance.
So on the topic of balance, players usually want one of two things. It's more frequent balance updates or certain skills to be split across the various game modes. This past year, we've seen more frequent than average balance patches, and over the past few years, we've seen specific skills get their balance split up against PvP, PvE, and World vs. World. And while I personally feel like these are good changes to come into the game, I also feel like they don't really go as far as I'd like them to go. Ideally, I would see complete skill splits across all three game modes, and I've always thought that PvP should probably just have completely different skills altogether. My favorite kind of competitive game is one that's easy to play and hard to master, and if you play PvE, you get used to your skills, and then you go into another game mode and it has those same skills, but they're balanced differently. I just feel like that's a barrier to entry that doesn't need to be there. That being said, you can't have the same balance as PvE or things won't play out quite right, and that's why I think there should be limited skills and they should be completely tailored to competitive play. My ideal version of PvP is only the core professions with no elite specializations, and those core professions are changed while maintaining their profession flavor to be more competitive-based classes. Since it would only be the core professions, there would be less skills and it would be much easier to balance. And while most people look at balance updates as a form of content for the competitive modes, with these changes you could actually focus on literal new content like new maps or new game types. Speaking about World vs. World would be mostly opinion-based because I don't really play that game mode all that often. As you may have guessed from my first video, I don't really like Zerg content, and that's sort of the king of Zerg content. But if ArenaNet ever makes changes to World vs. World that break up those Zergs and give us more specific activities to complete, I think the whole game mode could benefit from some World vs. World specific abilities. I know you can level up some abilities that'll make certain elements of World vs. World a little bit easier, like your supply carry weight, how much damage you do to certain NPCs or structures, but what if some of the utility skills or even each profession's elite skill would change when you went to World vs. World, and that new ability would be tied directly to something like summoning a catapult for free and it's on a longer cooldown. Perhaps another that would call in run some sort of airstrike or barrage of abilities that would destroy several arrow carts. Maybe a detonation bomb that would blow up one wall. In other words, I'd just like to see some profession-specific skills that are made solely for World vs. World.
Number 4, dungeons.
Depending on your experience with dungeons, you may already know that they've more or less been cast aside in favor of developing raids and fractals as the level 80 instanced multi-man content at the end of Guild Wars 2. And as level 80 content, I think fractals and raids are probably better suited to fit that bill. What I don't think is okay is that they're not doing anything to dungeons at all. Since 7 out of the 8 dungeons take place before you hit level 80, I think it makes sense to tie that into the leveling experience and tutorialize part of the game. Now, I'm aware that due to level scaling, a lot of people will just get full groups of level 80 players to play any of the dungeons so that they're as easy as possible to clear, but I don't think that's what dungeons should be going forward. Every dungeon in Guild Wars 2 has a story mode and a few explorable paths, and one of the last notable changes to dungeons we saw was that you can now play the final dungeon, or the story mode for that dungeon anyway, as a single player. Personally, I'd like to see that treatment on every single dungeon in the game, as those dungeon story paths have story tied to them, and as dungeons become less and less relevant, I think it's important that players still get to experience that story. Now, since that story can still be experienced if you find a group of willing participants, I don't think that's the biggest issue with dungeons, but I'd rather see dungeons changed in any way than just completely left off the table. My suggestion would just be to change all of those story paths to single player instances and add some tutorialization to each one. Then, as a bonus repeatable method of leveling, you could play one of those explorable paths. And I say one because I don't think that they're going to do any of this, but if I had to make a compromise, it would be to just do one of the explorable paths over and leave the other ones off the table. The explorable path they choose would be completely up to them. The only thing I would ask is that it reaffirms the mechanics that you were taught in the story version of that dungeon. As for the other explorable paths, I think they should cut up all those assets and start making fractals out of them, honestly. It's not like it'd be the first time that we did something like this where we made a fractal out of old content, just saying. The only real issue I could see with what I'm suggesting, outside of obvious labor and dev time that may or may not be worth it, is that the dungeons themselves aren't exactly exclusive to starter zones and areas where players who are still learning the game would get the most benefit out of a system like this. And to that I say it would require an additional change, and that's actually what we'll talk about next.
Number 5, looking for group.
As of right now, the best way to find a party for any content in the game is probably using the looking for group tool. Well, maybe not in the competitive modes, but if you're playing open world, fractals, raids, dungeons, you're probably going to be using the looking for group tool to find your party. And if you look at the looking for group tool, you'll see that everything is basically all on one page. Now, these are separated into categories, but I'd still argue that it would probably benefit from some tabs as opposed to the current setup. Ideally, I'd like to see a tab for open world that encompasses achievements, roleplay, leveling, completing certain living world, and of course any open world activities like meta events or just mucking about the game. There'd be a separate tab for raids, fractals, and dungeons, and even though I never really see anybody use these, you could make another tab for World vs. World and PvP. This would be a pretty small change overall, but I do think it would make navigating the looking for group tool a little bit easier for new players and a little less of a headache for players who are just trying to quickly get into some content. But alongside this change, I have another planned, and it is more of an addition than it is a change, but just bear with me. So a lot of other MMOs have this thing called a party finder or a dungeon finder, and while the looking for group tool is basically that feature, I just don't think that it's quite the same as it is in some other MMOs. Instead of a basic party finder that you can just say, hey, I'd like to play this content and be randomly matched with anyone else who wants to play that content, you get a field that you can type some text into. Sometimes it's something as simple as, hey, I'd like to play this fractal, dungeon, or raid. But most of the time, it's a wall of text demanding that certain classes be played wearing certain gear and they need to maintain certain boons. And yes, you want that if you're playing some higher level content. But by doing this, a lot of new players get scared off and they don't know what half of that stuff even means, and so they just avoid the content altogether. I think that Guild Wars 2 could benefit from a random hot join party party system for Fractal's raids and dungeons. Essentially, this would just be an extra button that says hot join or something to that effect, and when your party is found, you'll be teleported inside the content that you're actually about to play. So for Fractals, this would teleport you not to the Mistlock Observatory, but it would actually take you to the Fractal that was chosen at random with your party. For dungeons, this would take you to the dungeon and bypass having to walk all those distances in order to get to each one of these areas. And while I think it's safe to say that most people who hot join a raid probably won't complete that raid, it would be entirely more possible for groups of people to get together and just bash their head against the content until they figure it out, and not at the expense of more experienced players who are just trying to complete it as fast as possible. Ideally, in this scenario, you'd be able to specify what role you'd like to fill for the content that you're queuing for, and the game would actually specify how many of a certain role are allowed to queue for any given content. This just to prevent there being an entire party of support characters, for instance. As incentive to use this tool, I think there should be some sort of reward tied to hot join, and despite the addition of this, I think that the looking for group tool should probably stay about the same. I would change those tabs, but I do think it serves its purpose in the game. If you want a more specified group of people to come together and play certain content, you should be able to do that. I just also think you should be able to go at it completely blind and random, because at the end of the day, all of the content becomes infinitely more accessible if you can join it completely blind and random.
And for bonus number 6, the end of the personal story.
So as you could probably tell with my list, I focus mostly on changes to criteria, and this final even more unlikely change is no exception. Now, if you've never beaten the personal story and you want to, maybe click off now, because this actually deals with the final fight for criteria. For those of you guys who have followed the game for a while or have played since launch, hell, even if you've just beaten the personal story, you probably know exactly what I'm going to say, but the game desperately needs to do a redo of that final fight at the end of the game. Now, this is not to be contradictory of what I said about dungeons having every one of their instances become single player, so I do think that that final dungeon, the way that it plays out, is completely fine. I just think there should be something after it. So when you do finally get to Zaitan and you're fighting him and you're all excited because that's what the entire core game is led up to, and then you find out that all you have to do is essentially go up to a turret, spam the same button over and over again, and eventually the dragon just falls off a tower and dies. It just feels really bad, you guys. It just feels so bad in comparison to everything that came out after. Now, I would actually like to see some pretty big changes to the whole of the personal story, but I'm not going to go into all of that right now. Instead, I'd like to just focus on this one encounter, because I think this one change could make or break people's experience when they're playing through the game the first time. The first break I ever took from Guild Wars 2 was when I beat Zaitan, got really mad about it, and then just didn't play the game for like 6 months. And while I can't say that that's going to be the experience for everyone, anytime I've ever explained this fight to any of my friends, they completely agree right off the bat that that is just no way to end an entire story arc. Maybe they just shouldn't have made the fights that follow it so much better, but now more than ever, I just feel like Corteria is needing a bit of a rework, and I think a great place to start is the frickin' Zaitan fight. And that, guys, is 6 things that I would change. These are not the only 6 things, but they are 6 things that I think about in my spare time, so I thought I'd make a video and see if you guys agree or what you would change if you could. Just like with the things that I would add, feel free to let me know your thoughts down in the comments. And just as a reminder, I am trying to bring back a topic series called Imagined Burden in 2019, so if any of these individual changes sounds like something you'd like a video in more depth on, let me know down in the comments as well. As always, guys, thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.